Hello and welcome to the Perspective Podcast. First of all, if you haven't heard the introduction to this season about manhood and why I'm even doing it about this topic, then listen to that now. There's also two other episodes live where I speak about manhood with a man in Ghana and a man in Morocco. And now I wanted to find a bit of a different perspective. So I found a transgender male. This I think was super interesting because this person really must have a different view about manhood because a transgender man is not born as a man, he's born as a woman and then chooses to identify as a man. So they must have something about what it means to be a man or what it means to be masculine that really drives them so much, that really gets them so much that they go through the difficult process of changing their gender. So yeah, it was a super interesting conversation that I had with Aiden. He's a guy from Belgium. I really don't know that much about him apart from this conversation. It's the first time I met him. We had to do it online because we're not in the same location. But yeah, I hope you enjoy the episode and I think you will get a lot from it. I definitely did. And it was a very different perspective to what I'm used to. And that's what it's all about. So enjoy listening to the episode and let me know what you think. So, hello, Aiden. Welcome. The first thing I always ask the guests, and I'm also very curious, is if you can introduce yourself a bit and tell a bit about your story, who you are, and what you're doing at the moment.
Yes, hello. So my name is Eden. I grew up in Belgium, but was born in Belgium. I am the child of a Belgian father and a Surinamese mother. So I have a bit mixed roots as well. At this moment, I work as a social worker in an integration office in Belgium. So I help newcomers in this country to learn Dutch, to make sure that they understand the culture here a little bit about what's different or what's the same and how they can find like a good social network here so that they can find a place in the new home.
Okay, that's interesting. Must be very fulfilling work.
Yeah, it is. It can be difficult, but it can also be very rewarding when you get an email after a few weeks or a few months like, oh, my Dutch courses are going very well. I've made some friends here. I started with a club or a hobby. And then I'm just really happy because I know that they found like their little place in their little community.
Yeah, wow. That's amazing. That's amazing. Okay, and the reason why I had you in this podcast here today is because I was very curious to speak to about the topic manhood, of course, and I was very curious to speak to a transgender male.
Yeah.
And I also heard like you are transgender male, but can you tell a bit more about that part? When did you realize that, and how did that go for you?
Yeah. So I think I have a little bit of an atypical course. You have like a course that it's mostly told in the mainstream media, or so to say. And that mainstream course is like, oh, I knew it since I was a little child and I've been striving to become that way. I didn't really know as a child. I don't think I experienced gender that much in a sense. The toys that I played with, for example, were both cars and Barbies. My hobbies involved both judo for a while, to give an example, but I also did ice skating for a very long time. So when it came to my dressing style, my hobby, my expression, it was very much all over the spectrum. But at a certain point when I was 16, I did start to question it like, okay, I don't think I'm a girl. I don't know if I'm a boy. I'm not sure. But because I grew up in an environment that wasn't really familiar with what is transgender, what does that mean? How can it show themselves? People told me, first of all, like, oh, you're probably just a tomboy, which is basically a way of saying, like, this is a girl who presents very masculine. And because I also didn't know better, I just kind of took that on face value, like, oh, okay, I'm a tomboy. Once I started going to college, though, I met more queer people. I met more people in, you know, from different contexts. And I heard more of those stories that were also not from that mainstream. And I learned a lot more about what transgender can mean. And that's when I started to realize about when I was 19 years old that, oh, okay, I'm trans. There's no way about this. I am like those people. That's when I started to make appointments with hospitals, with therapists to kind of figure out like, okay, I know this now. Where do I go from here? What are my options? What course is there in front of me? And what do I need to do to get through that course successfully? It took me a few years to get to this point because, again, I was 19 years old when I figured out that I was trans, that I was masculine and not just like a girl presenting masculine. It took a few years of like psychologists to get through that, and a pandemic made it quite hard to continue that course as well. But I'm very glad to be at the point where I am right now in my life.
Okay, wow, that's super interesting. Especially because how you say it, it's more or less a genderless youth that you had.
Yeah.
Like there was not such an emphasis on a man has to be this or a woman has to be this or something, if I understand it correctly.
Well, there was, but I think because I'm a bit neurodiverse as well, I just kind of ignored it. Like there definitely was a sense of like, because I grew up in quite a rural area. So there definitely was a sense of like, okay, a girl should do this and a boy should do that. I just always kind of was like, meh, I don't care. I want to do this. I want to do
Yeah,
that.
okay.
I want to explore. And my parents were kind of like okay with it. I think they just let it happen and they were like, oh, my kid is going through some experimental phases. You know what? Let them go through it. So they didn't really fight it, although they had some feedback sometimes. Environment, on the other hand, did fight back from time to time. I really had like a childhood and especially a teenhood where I got a lot of flack from classmates, for example. So it wasn't always easy, but I also for me, I didn't fully understand why this was such a big deal that I did certain things, that I expressed myself in a certain way, that I had hobbies that were considered both masculine and feminine. And I just, did what I wanted. And that for some people, that was a huge problem. For others, it was like, okay, this is weird, but, let him be. Let him be.
Yeah,
He's not doing any harm. It's just weird. He's just a
yeah.
weird kid.
Okay. And
Uh,
did you, during all those years, did you feel like you fit in with the side of people around you? No?
no, absolutely not. There were a few people, I would say, like the other weirdos, the other freaks. When I look back at those people, or, I look them up on Facebook, they turned out to be queer too. Like, who knew? Like minded people find each other, even when they're childs, and you don't know what it is that you are, or that you have a certain connection and what it might be. But then you look back and it's like, oh, my best childhood friend, a friend that I loved dearly when it was like elementary school. Oh, he just married his husband. But great for him. But definitely when it came to like, most of the children, I definitely didn't fit in. And it did bother me. I'm gonna be honest about that. Even though I was very much of the attitude, like, I don't get it. I'm just, experimenting and see what I like, and I like doing this hobby. It did bother me that I got so much flack from it. And I was also looking at options like, should I conform a bit more? Because I did know that I did realize that I wasn't conforming to standards. I was aware of the standards. I just didn't care for them. But I also wondered, like, should I? And I have leaned very heavily into very feminine aspects because I did break at a certain point under that pressure of like, okay, I should start wearing dresses. I should grow my hair. I should start wearing makeup. I didn't love it. It wasn't the worst thing, but I love it. It was more or less just the option taken away from me from self expression and self exploration because of the peer pressure. And unfortunately, me caving into that.
Yeah, I get that. And you said as well before that you feel masculine.
Hmm?
You feel that's very strong. So strong that, yeah, I assume that you didn't feel comfortable with your body at first.
Yeah.
But what does that masculine feeling mean to you? Like, what does it mean? What does it mean to be a man?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question to me. For me, it's really hard to describe other than just it's a feeling. It was for me a feeling up until I got my top surgery of looking into the mirror and hating my chest. It was I I found it funny to look back at certain moments in my childhood or teenhood that, for example, I never got it, but I really wanted like a piercing underneath my lip, just like a little ball or something like that. Because, and I told this to people, like, it's the closest I'll ever get to getting a beard. Somehow I didn't realize at 16-year-old and saying that I could have been masculine. But I was like, "Oh, yeah, I want this piercing because, we'll never be able to grow a beard, but at least this way I can kind of get it." It's in those little things that I found out that I had a certain masculinity in it, in myself. And
And
yeah,
if I can interrupt there, because it's super interesting to me to hear, and that is also, that is a bit of that is a way of expressing yourself. Of course, you want to look masculine, and you want to look like that, and you feel happier if you see that in the mirror, right?
mhm.
But what about the mental part of it? What does it mean to, like, feeling feeling masculine? What does that mean to you?
For me personally, it's a feeling of comfort. It's a feeling of coming home to yourself, feeling safe, feeling comfortable. Let's see. Again, it's very hard to describe because it was definitely a very big sense of discomfort at first, and looking at other people and looking at other men, relating to those men at certain points, not always, but at certain points, really relating to them. Um, and kind of feeling like one of the boys. But how to describe that feeling, how to dissect it really, I still kind of struggle with that today. Maybe it is also because I feel, again, from childhood, like gender to me was very much a thing of like, oh, it's being forced upon me. So why should I define myself by standards that were made up by someone else that I need to conform to? While for me, it's just I like this part of this gender and I like this part of this gender. Let's fucking combine it to something that I feel personally feel very comfortable with. So to fully define manhood for me is, to be honest, comfort, safety, coming home to yourself and feeling comfortable with yourself. But I
Yeah,
also realized that could also, you know, go for a womanhood as well.
yeah, exactly. And in terms of that, in terms of the comparison to womanhood, the comparison of the masculine and the feminine,
Mhm.
how do you feel about that? In what way are men different than women, and are they different?
I would say there's more sociological difference than really biological or mental. There are a few, like, how do you say it, researchers out there that explore the differences between manhood and womanhood. First of all, I'm also thinking like, where's the non-binary factor in that? Like, there are people who are just not on that spectrum whatsoever, or go between that, and they just kind of fall out from that. But also, when I read articles, for example, about those researches, the differences are made to be so huge. It's like the stereotype of like women are from Venus and men are from Mars. While if you read the research paper itself, it's really just minuscule differences, and are also a lot just like, yes, sociologically implied or put upon people by a society or by a culture. Because if you even look biologically, we as humans are such a mess biologically that, yeah, it helped for me to get testosterone. I still get testosterone today. It's why I got my lower voice, my beard, a bit more of a masculine frame. But on the other hand, I'm also like, I didn't change that much because of my transition. I just became more comfortable with myself and therefore started expressing myself in different ways. So I don't know if I became more masculine. I became more masculine in looks for sure, but I don't think I became more masculine in expression per se. And I feel like it's the same way for womanhood or gender in general.
Yeah. So if I understand correctly, you feel there's not that big of a difference between men and women. And correct me if I'm wrong, right? But
Mhm.
you were born as a girl, and then but you felt that you were a man, but that was mostly, and you feel like that, but that is mostly in terms of as expressing yourself and how you look to other people and what type of sociological group you want to fit in.
I suppose so. I suppose that's the most accurate way of describing it because I also do feel like a man. I am a man. The way that we as trans people usually describe it is that we have assigned gender to genitalia, right? If we look at a baby and it's born, just born, the doctor will open up the legs or look between the legs and they will look at how big is that little knob between there and your legs. And that's really how to decide that you're a boy or a girl, like just how big is that knob. But really, I feel like once you start to dissect gender and biology and sex, it gets so complicated that at this point, I'm like, okay, I feel like a man. I am a man because I identify as such. And the way I identify as a man is really just felt. It's really just a feeling that is difficult for me to explain, but because again, I am a bit well read into like gender. I was also forced to be well read because if you go to therapy, you go to a psychologist, you really have to dissect and you do nothing else than just dissect your gender and your gender identity. So that's why at a certain point, I think we also just get tired of it.
Yeah,
We're
yeah.
like, just give me the medication. I don't want to talk about this again. Like, come on. How much do I need to prove myself here? So yeah, it's a complicated subject to me because at a certain point I was just like reading another research article and doing self-reflection again. And I was just like, this is just one big soup. Gender expression and gender, how we identify and how we express has been has been changing so much from like the beginning of mankind, what we can find up until this point. And it's like it's just one big soup and it really changes from time to time what we see as masculine.
And how about the sociological aspect, right? How
Mhm.
about the role of men and women in society? Do you
Yeah.
feel that is different? And aside from what it may be, what the society might tell you that it is, how do you feel? How do you feel would be best? Would it be best if everything is equal, or is it best if men have a certain role and women have a certain role? Of course, not that you have to be this if you're a man, but like more generally.
Yeah, I get what you mean. Well, at this point, I do feel that even though it might be a little bit less, there's still gender roles are still a thing. I do feel that pressure of gender roles, and I personally do think that it's really a big shame when that happens, when those gender roles are enforced. So for me personally, it's really I would if I could change this world the way I wanted to, I would get rid of gender roles and I would look at the person themselves like, okay, what is your talent? What are you comfortable with? What are your goals, your dreams? And to not be limited by those gender roles or by things that we force upon people. For example, like men still have a stigma around showing certain emotions or crying. Crying is only allowed in certain situations when you're at a funeral or when you had just like became a father, then you're allowed to cry, but also not too dramatic. Keep it cool. You don't need to look cool when you cry. But I just recently saw The Last of Us episode 3 and I bawled like a little bitch. Like it's just, and I should be able to do so. I shouldn't be, nor should any other man for that matter, feel like I'm not allowed to cry with what is truly emotionally touching. If I have that feeling or I feel that need to cry, I should be able to do so because it's healthy. And the fact that men get told like you're not allowed to express emotions or not in a certain way, or you can't do this, you can't do that because it's not considered masculine. That's how we see more violence with men, for example, towards other people because that's all just pent up energy and that needs to go somewhere. It doesn't disappear, it goes somewhere and it either turns towards themselves, they might get suicidal, For example, here in Belgium, we have a very high suicide rate, and it's especially high with men, which is because they have trouble expressing certain things or addressing certain things. That's a huge problem. Is I mean, suicide in general is a huge problem, but that men are feel at a certain point like I cannot express myself in such a way that my only way out is to off myself, to really put it bluntly. That's a huge problem. That's violence towards yourself. It also just can happen to other people. And that's also a huge problem. And I do feel it's not all of it, of course, but I do feel the fact that men feel such societal pressure to suppress certain things, certain emotions, certain feelings. It's still energy, it's still there, and it's gonna burst at some point. So why not give healthy alternatives like crying to express those emotions, to express those fears? It's all connected to me to gender roles. And of course, for women, it goes the same way. So I feel it's very limiting. And I feel like gender roles or, or the way that we expect people to behave is just unhealthy in so many ways.
I I very much agree with the part that it should not it should not limit you to be who you want to be. Like
Mhm.
100%. I 100% agree with that. It's very, very important that even if there's societal pressure to be this or that, if you're a man, if you don't feel like that, then I mean, be whoever you want to be, of course.
Mhm.
But I'm curious how you feel about this because there is always in some term of way there is a type of culture, right? So
Yeah.
and that is I think part of the culture. The man and woman roles can be a part of the culture, and if the man and woman roles are not there, then it's also part of the culture, which is distilling to children. And do you then feel that it is because of those minor biological differences that is maybe good to treat and to have different expectations and cultural ways of seeing men and seeing women because they are different, so we have to treat them different? Or do you think it's better if we just treat everyone the same?
I think it's somewhere in between. So for me, it's less about gender or the way that we see gender to be and gender roles. And again, more at the individual because we assume that that all men have the same type of biology, right? But again, I'm referring to certain research papers here about biology, and that there's also just like huge biological differences between men as well. Certain men have higher testosterone levels, other have just more flexible limbs, also are hormonal. There are intersex people who present masculine, have, as far as we can tell, a masculine body, all of that. And it's just that way we can never really know because we truly can't see hormones on the outside of the skin, nor can we see it if we operate. We can't see it in the muscles. It's something so encoded into our material as how we are made that we sometimes just can't tell.
So in terms of what you're saying now, I feel like you see gender. Tell me if this is right or wrong. You see this
Mhm.
as masculine and feminine, and gender is not masculine or feminine, but it's a spectrum, and you can be
Yeah.
anywhere on that spectrum.
Yeah, or you can fall off the spectrum.
Yeah.
You can just ignore it. You can be all over the spectrum. Um, it, I feel like what we define as gender at this moment is also just limited by the words that we have, by the linguistic knowledge that we have. Because every day that I go online and I see these queer scenes or I talk with people, there's just so much diversity and beauty to it. And that 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 diversity and beauty just doesn't always fit in the language that we have at this moment or the knowledge that we have at this moment. So I feel like acknowledgement at that point is just a bit more important than having to see like, oh, okay, you're that role because based upon that gender, you have to express yourself this way or that way. It's just like, okay, show us who you are and we can give you the world that way.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Interesting. Interesting. And then, because we were talking about those gender roles as well, and that society places this is what men are and this is what women are.
Mhm.
How do you think those gender roles arise? Like, how do you think that came to be? That we even see it like that?
That's a very good question. I think it's both historical. I think it's mostly historical. It's like certain things happened in the past. Certain philosophers came up and expressed certain opinions that got ingrained. We have certain structures. See, for example, the church, who has taken opinions of Aristotle. And Aristotle, for example, very much expressed the opinion of like um, women are subservient to men. He truly believed that, and it is part of his philosophy. A lot of people nowadays just don't think shit of Aristotle, by the way. If you go to philosophy classes, Aristotle at this point is a laughing stock. But that doesn't take away that his philosophy has taken over by, for example, the Roman Catholic Church and is still practiced in some churches to this very day. Women are subservient to men. I hope no one will take that out of context, what I just said.
Or add that into a clip and put that on.
A little soundbite. No. So I think it's based upon historical and it changes how it expresses over the years. Because I do think that behind gender roles are certain values, and maybe those gender roles might change, but the values haven't necessarily changed with them. It just expresses in a different way.
But one thing about that,
Because what is super interesting to me is I spoke before on manhood to a man in Ghana and a man in Morocco, which a place where the gender roles are very strong.
Mhm.
And their view was mainly that those gender roles are really beneficial to society because they built us to where we are now. That
Mhm.
those gender roles are fundamental in a society and all those societies around the world, which were built upon those gender roles, and they express that as the way of, like, that is just the natural and the ultimate way of building a society,
Mhm.
and this, which is why it is the most effective, and which is why we should continue doing that. And they also said if a man wants to be a dad that stays at home and take care of the kids, that's okay, but
Mhm.
the gender roles, like, generally are something that is good for society. That's how they mostly saw it summed up. How do you feel about that?
I have complicated feelings with it because there's a lot that goes into gender. It's not just one aspect. There's a lot of history going in it. There's a lot of sociology going into it. There's a lot of culture going into it. There's also like racism going into it because there were moments in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, um, where gender was a lot more freely expressed. Or I'll take something a bit more close to home or something that I'm a bit more familiar with, India, for example. There was a hijra. They're still there, by the way. I'm expressing this wrong, but the hijra still exists. But the hijra are what we would call in the West trans women. There's a bit more nuance to it, but it's not really my place to fully explain this. But this like when men, women, and on the hijra, which was a third gender, is a third gender, um, they were considered holy in the past before the British came. The hijra were holy. They were very important people in the community. But when the British came and colonized, they were like, this is disgusting. We don't want this. And they outlawed it. They very heavily punished this. And that tendency that the British forced upon the Indian people still lives there today. The Hishra are still present, but they are very much suppressed and oppressed. So I feel a bit iffy speaking for countries like Morocco and Ghana, where I'm not that familiar with the culture or the history of colonization or what gender used to be in the past before colonization happened. So I feel a bit iffy to speak for that. All I can speak for is my own what I see in my daily reality and what I experience and what I read. But I'm not that
Yeah.
well read about Morocco
Yeah, no,
or
of
Ghana, to be
course.
fair. I can understand where they come from, mind you. I don't necessarily I agree, but I understand. Yeah, for me, my personal experience and what I see with my friends and family who are also queer it can really have huge mental impacts when they are told they need to be a certain way or act a certain way because they are a woman or a man. And in that way, I feel like we have changed as a culture already so many times over, all over the world. Why not do it again? Why not be open to that idea of like, okay, maybe these gender roles, for example, don't need to be this strict, don't need to be enforced upon people. And yeah, for me personally, I'm really just like abolish it and look at the people themselves, look at the person, the individual. But I also know that this is coming from a very Western perspective where individuality is very important. So I also take that into account. But it is also just my personal opinion. It's also like because I really, human rights, for example, I work around those as well. For example, in my daily job, I remind people of the rights they have here in this country as refugees or as expats, what they can't do or what they can do, what they might not know. So it's really just a daily thing for me. And it's really important for me to remind people that they have those human rights and to see that gender roles can also infringe upon those human rights. It aggravates me.
Yeah. Okay, super interesting. And it's all about, of course, you don't have to speak on Ghana and Morocco, but it's super interesting to hear your perspective on this. That's what it's all about. So thank you for sharing that. Then one thing I want to ask you: the traditional gender roles, they are more the man is responsible financially and the woman stays at home and takes care of the kids. What would you say if a man in the society in Belgium right now is like that? He just feels like that is the best way, and he feels like he wants to find a wife that raises the kids and stays at home and cooks, and he wants to be the provider of the family financially. Would you say there's something wrong with that? Like, is there something inherently toxic in there?
It depends on the motivation. It really depends on the motivation and how it expresses itself. I feel like if you force another person to adapt a certain role, that's bad. But if you find someone, a partner in life, who says like, I want to be a stay at home mom. I want to provide for the children or for the family at home. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But I do feel like if it's forced upon you or you feel like you have to do that because that's what's expected, then I feel like it's our responsibility as a community to remind them that alternatives exist and that if you really want this, there's nothing wrong with that. There is nobility and there is good things about staying at home and taking care of the home and taking care of children, taking care of your partner. Because let's be honest, taking care of a home and taking care of a family, it's a full-time job. It's tiring. I live here with a roommate. I don't have a partner. I don't have children. I already have trouble keeping up with like taking care of a household while working a job. I get it that people want to stay at home if that's really what they want to do. But if it's more like, what it's expected, it's what I should do, then I'm like, that's not what you have to do.
Yeah, super
Something
interesting to
else.
me, because
Yeah.
it's also to the men in Ghana and Morocco that I spoke to, although their views are what the ideal is, right?
Mhm.
It's are very different. They're all saying this, that no matter what, you should not be forced to do this or that. Like that, I mean,
Mhm.
if you want to do something else, that's okay, and you should be free to do so. And it's just super interesting to see, because there it's like switched around, right? So there it
Yeah.
is normal for the man to take that role of being the provider and the woman to stay at home. And then if a woman then wants to or a man wants to be in an equal family where they both work and take care of the household evenly, then that is kind of out of then you have to kind of resist the societal pressure, right?
Yeah.
But in the same in us, like if I would want to be the provider of the family, which I and just want my future wife to stay at home, which I don't want. But if
Mhm.
I would want it, I would have to resist an entire really big societal pressure, which is just the other part of the spectrum. So it's super interesting to see that.
Yeah.
And do you think that there's also the biological factor in there? Because, for example, when we speak about masculine and feminine, the feminine is more caring, more agreeable, more taking care. And that is also, for example, women score higher in the trait agreeableness. So women are in general a bit more agreeable than men. Doesn't mean that every woman is more agreeable than a man, but just in general, right? But and also the fact that they give birth, right? The women are the ones giving birth, which comes with tremendous change in their body and feeling and hormones and all this
Mhm.
complicated stuff that generally it is, because I think that's what's happening in those societies, is that generally that puts the women in that role. And then of course if they don't want that role, then you have to resist the societal pressure to get out of that role. But there's always a societal pressure there, right? So what is, even if the roles are to be equal, if you want to be different, you have to resist that societal pressure. So
Yeah. It's funny that you said like how women can birth children, because I can still birth children too at this point.
wow.
And there are actually a few very interesting documentaries. The name of the man escaped me, but I am aware that two documentaries exist about men giving birth. Trans men who have kept their ovaries, have kept their womb, and carried their child up until the end and gave birth themselves. So even there, if it's so stretchable that even men or not non-binary people, non-binary people can give birth at this point. So for me, again, it's so stretchable and it's so malleable. And I think that's the beauty of humankind in general, that we have the ability to adapt and change according to circumstances. That's the reason that we, survived this long.
Yeah,
That's the reason we're
I
still
noticed
alive.
in this talk with you that you don't like to speak in a generalized way,
Yeah,
if I understand correctly. So yeah, so if saying that in general women are more like this or men are more like this, then
yeah,
that is,
yeah. I suppose I struggle a little bit in that regard, because it's not necessarily a bad thing to generalize in in certain ways, but generalizations are being used to oppress people as well. For example, if you say like women are usually more agreeable, some people will take that as that, right? They will say like, okay, it's not for everyone, but sometimes, or we see that of statistics that we see this more happening with women than with men. But other people will take that out of context and will use that to oppress other people. So I feel like I'm really aware of that at a certain point, again because of so much self-reflection. And maybe it's also relevant information, but I was an intern for 2 years with Varia VZ2, which is like the umbrella organization of Flanders and Dutch-speaking Brussels for LGBT rights. So when I did my studies, I did my internship with them. So I was also just like fully immersed in that theme, and I still am today in less ways, but I still am. So I feel like in that way, we we as a community had to battle so much against generalizations, because generalizations have been used to at certain points even just kill our people. And that's why I feel so iffy about generalizations.
yeah, I get it.
As a queer man, for example, I'm not an old enough to have lived through the 80s, but I still see the effects of the 80s, the AIDS crisis today. If I look enough, like there are not that many people, not that many gay men of like 50, 60, 70 years old, because they have lost their lives in the AIDS crisis, because that AIDS crisis was spurred by the generalization of gay men are perverts and they are a sin of God and they shouldn't exist. So
Yeah,
if they get that virus, that AIDS virus, it's a punishment of God and they deserved it. And I suppose that's why I feel so iffy about using generalizations, because it has been used to harm, and harm a lot, and harm entire communities of people who are already struggling. So maybe that gives a little bit more context to why I'm like I'm not using
Yeah.
generalizations as much as possible, because I see a lot of diversity and I want to acknowledge that diversity as much as possible, and I want to honor that diversity as much as
Yeah.
possible.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Super interesting. Okay, those were my questions. Super interesting to hear. It's a very different perspective than the man in Morocco and Ghana, and that's why, yeah, super
Yeah.
interesting to hear. So thank you for doing this. One last thing I want to ask you
Yeah.
is, do you have something to say or some sort of advice or thing to say to the audience?
Sure. I think it's very important that if you have questions about who you are, if the way you feel certain things or express certain things, is it okay? Um, I just want to say it is. It might not always be safe in the environment that you are in. The people surrounding you might not always support you, but it does not invalidate in who you are, what you feel, and what you express. You are enough and you are good. And you feeling being this way that you are, it's not a sin. It's not a big it's really not a sin, and you're valid in who you are. That's the biggest thing I want to give away.
Thank you. Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you very much for doing this.
So that concludes my episode with Aiden. It was a really interesting one, very different than the ones before. And in the next episode, I will be speaking to someone else again. And after which I will place my thoughts on this, what I've learned from doing this, and announce what the next season is going to be about. So thank you very much for listening. And if you like the episode, please leave a 5-star review. It really means a lot. The 5-star review on Spotify or on Apple Podcast, wherever you're listening, it really helps a lot whilst recording this. Thank you very much and see you in the next one. Bye bye.